A broad-based scheme is any form of ownership which involves a large number of people having shares in the company. The question is, how many people is a large number? How many people do you have to have before you are considered broad-based? Now, in the BE codes as they stand today, there is no fixed number. The only clue that we have is that in draft versions of the codes, they actually refer to 50 as being the number. So if you had more than 50 members in a scheme, then the scheme was broad-based, and under 50 it wasn't. At the moment, because there's no fixed number, verification agencies sort of use their own interpretation or their own judgment as deciding whether a scheme is broad-based or not. So some may say, well, 30, that looks like kind of okay. It looks like a broad-based scheme to us, so we'll consider it. But 50 is usually a general rule of thumb. When you think about it, though, a broad-based scheme is a scheme that is meant to benefit a broad grouping of people, a community, all the staff and their families. You're looking at something which involves large numbers, usually in the hundreds, in the thousands perhaps, rather than in the tens. So that's really what a broad-based scheme is. When using trusts as a vehicle for ownership, one has to pay attention to the fact that the BE codes have very specific rules that trusts have to fulfill in order to be qualifying as valid ownership vehicles. And the reason that companies did this, the reason the DTI did this, was that they noticed that trusts were a very loose vehicle for ownership. And you could change the criteria very easily. So people would set up staff ownership schemes using a trust, and then they would just change the criteria for who would become a member of that or beneficiary of that trust as they went along, as they saw fit. And so in order to sort of tighten up the ownership, to make it more like direct shareholding, remember, that's what they're trying to achieve in terms of ownership, is you're trying to achieve the effect of having direct shareholding in the company without actually directly owning shares. So the trust holds the shares, the beneficiaries get the benefit of the trust. But the problem is that if you leave it too loose, beneficiaries don't then have any voting rights, because all they receive is some benefit from the trust as and when the trustees of the trust see fit. So they had to tighten up the rules in order to make sure that the trusts would qualify. This has led to quite a few problems with trusts that were constituted before the codes were gazetted in 2007, and particularly with family trusts. They're set up really to protect the beneficiaries from any liability, and therefore they're deliberately made loose and vague in terms of who has liability. And it's now difficult because families now have to revisit this in order to be able to score points. And there are many instances where verification agencies have gone in and said, yes, you're, Mr. Shabalala, you're a black man, your wife is black, your children are all black, but sorry, we can't recognize any black ownership because your trust doesn't fall into the rules as laid out in the BE codes. So yes, you must pay attention. If you're going to have a lawyer draw up a trust agreement for some sort of trust ownership in the company, they must pay attention to the rules for trusts in the BE codes. An ESOP is an employee share ownership program, and that unfortunately is a very vague and general definition, which a lot of companies have used to cover things like bonus schemes and profit sharing schemes. One has to realize that if you're going to use an ESOP as a way of scoring points in BE, there has to be physical ownership of the shares. Even if you use a trust, the trust must own the shares in the company. It mustn't be a virtual situation where come the end of the year, an accounting calculation is done to work out what the profit would be and therefore what the effective shareholding of your staff would be, and therefore what their bonus then is. That doesn't count. There has to be ownership in the company in order to qualify for ownership points.